Hi, my name is Isaac Record. Welcome, thank you for coming. I am a postdoctoral research fellow at the Semaphore Research Group, which has its lab upstairs on the 7th floor of this building. Matt wanted me to talk about how I came to be in this position, but I'm not going to, so if you are curious, please ask me at the end. Instead, I'm just going to kind of jump in. So this is a talk about the relationship between emerging technologies like 3D scanning and printing and traditional humanities research. And I'm going to focus on history and philosophy of science because that's the discipline within the humanities that I know best. So the idea of 3D scanning and printing has been in the public consciousness at least since the Star Trek replicator. But most of us probably haven't actually, this is probably not the room to say this, but I'll say it anyway. Most of us probably haven't encountered 3D scanning and printing in the context of our humanities research. And my question today is, should we? And I don't just mean, should we study the emergence of 3D scanning and printing, but I mean, can we, as, for example, historians of technology, use 3D scanners and printers to do our research? So the plan of the talk is basically to start by giving you some examples of 3D scanning and printing in the humanities. An example, a prominent example where 3D scanning technology really contributed to the research, and then some examples that I'm involved in, and you can play with these pieces that are at the front. And then I'm going to discuss two theses about what the relationship can or should be between the use of these technologies and humanities researchers. So the weak thesis, the weak version, is just to say that the sort of research that I'm going to describe is acceptable. It's an acceptable activity for a historian of technology, for example, to be engaged in. And that has something to do, I think, basically with disciplinary standards and arguments, disciplinary standards of argument and of evidence. And then I'm going to consider a stronger thesis, which is that 3D scanning and printing make possible certain kinds of investigations that should actually now be considered necessary within the humanities for those scholars who want to make certain kinds of arguments. So first, I want to talk about an example where a 3D technology made a significant contribution to research in history of technology. So this is a piece of what's known as the Antikythera mechanism. It was recovered around 1900 off in the remains of a shipwreck off a Greek island. That's Kythera. And the exact provenance and function of this object were then unknown. In fact, it was a bit of a confusing artifact because it was found among bits of pottery and coins and other artifacts that dated to long before gears like this were thought to have been produced by the Greeks. So for a long time there was debate as to whether this was even a real thing or if it was some kind of hoax. And once it was, and for those who decided that it probably was real, it was not clear what the thing did. And this was in part because of corrosion and it's being kind of embedded in this calcified rock that prevents you from doing a lot of investigating. So some of the gear teeth were corroded, some of the gears were clearly missing. They were strewn all over the place, different pieces were strewn here and there, and it was not clear how they were supposed to be pieced together. And a lot of the detail, especially any writing on the object, was just covered up by this calcification process that had happened over the 1,000-some years that the thing had been underwater. So the point is there's no non-destructive traditional method of figuring out what this thing is. You could maybe find out a little bit about it by chipping away at the rock, but this could also damage the thing irreparably. But in the 1970s, so 70 years after it was brought up, Derek de Solla Price and a Greek physicist whose first name I'm not going to attempt, but whose last name is Karakalos, made X-ray and gamma ray scans of this object and the other pieces. And from those, they were able to sort of guess at the number of gears around there, and so guess at the gear ratios, and piece together a credible story of what this thing might have done based on their existing knowledge of the sorts of things that they knew Greeks were interested in keeping track of, like the motion of planets. So the motion of planets and gear ratios have some well-known relationships, so they could sort of look at these things and say, okay, that's pretty close to 70 years, 70 teeth, so we're going to assume that it was 70. That's the sort of reasoning that they used. So they came up with this plausible story about it, and then in the 90s, so 20 years later, another historian of technology, Wright, used X-ray tomography to re-scan this object. And the difference between a regular X-ray scan and X-ray tomography is that tomography gives you a sense, it sort of gives you a slice through the object. So it gives you a good idea of what's going on three-dimensionally. It's not just a picture like a bone X-ray where you can see fractures and things like that. You can actually see the detail all the way through. And from his scans, he was almost immediately able to show that Price's analysis was wrong. He was able to get a better count of the teeth on the gears, and he was actually also able to recover some of the markings that were on the device. As a bonus, because he was using this sort of computerized equipment, he could create a 3D model of the object and make the entire model plus the scans available to other researchers. So this is in contrast to the X-ray scans that would just show up, like in a doctor's office, and stick them up and look at. So these are digital files. You can go to HP's website and download them if you want to. They're large files, so be careful. Or you can go online and play with this model. So clearly, the use of this 3D technology made some significant advances to the history of this device, to the understanding of this device. Now, most of us don't have access to multi-million-dollar tomography scanners, and most artifacts aren't as mysterious to begin with as the Antikythera is. So why discuss such an exceptional case? Well, I think it's particularly revealing of some of the possibilities that come when you use emerging technology to investigate artifacts like this. So first of all, it's not clear that Price or Wright or any of these other scholars had any responsibility to do the X-ray scans. But as soon as they had been done, everyone else in the field had the responsibility to respond to them. Right? They could respond to them by rejecting them. They could give an alternative interpretation of the scans. Or they could provide additional evidence that would, as Wright did with the tomography scans, to sort of overturn the interpretations that had been based on simple X-ray scans. So the one thing I want to emphasize here is that the actions of one member of the community changed the epistemic responsibilities of everyone else in the community. Now I want to turn to two ongoing projects that I'm involved in that also bring together 3D technologies, in this case much less expensive 3D printing printers and scanners, and HPS type work, history and philosophy of science type work. And I want to draw some lessons from these cases about disciplinary standards. So the first case is this faux heritage object here, which you can hand around. So it's just a wooden mask. You can see that there are actually pieces missing from the one that I'm handing around. The jaw has been removed and the eyes have been removed. And what we're doing is just doing a surface scan of that object. So on the left is the original wooden mask. It's sitting on a reflective surface. So this is actually the light that's above. And on the right is a compiled 3D scan on a computer screen. So scanning an object like this takes several hours, and manipulating the image in software to create the image you see on the right, that takes considerably longer. But we think that even with the amount of time that this takes, it's considerably less time than you would have to spend recreating the object by other means, like designing it yourself in software. This is assuming you want a digital replica as your end product. If you want a cast, you can cast it probably pretty quickly. There are some challenges for casting objects like this. It's you might damage an object like this. You have to be careful what you choose so that it's not going to seep into the wood. Scanning is in some ways it allows you to gain information from an object, basically without touching it. Light touches it, that's it. And that may be safer for certain objects. And the measurements that you get from 3D scanning are quite precise. They're accurate down to the millimeter. The second project that I'm involved with is the reconstruction of Chambers' micromanipulator. Chambers worked here at U of T. And on the left is an image from a textbook of his micromanipulator setup. So this is, the idea is that you're using these control knobs to change this syringe to actually inject into a sample that's in this box here. So you've got a microscope, you set it up on this thing, and you twiddle the knobs, and something happens that you can watch through the microscope. This is what's left of it, right? We don't have the microscope, we don't have these pillars. All that's left is this structure here and the actual loops. The box here is gone, these mounting plates are gone, and most relevant for what I'm working on, these control pillars are also missing. So this is a CAD drawing of one of those control pillars made by Eric Wiedenhammer over at the Institute for History, Philosophy of Science and Technology. He drew this in a program called SketchUp. It's free, you can download it off the internet. And I imported this drawing into the 3D printer software, which takes it and turns it into layers and adds support material to be able to print the thing out. And then I printed it. So this is what it looks like when it comes off the printer. It's surrounded by a sort of waxy support material, and the finished product are right there, and do feel free to pass those around. So this is the finished object as it was set up for display. So Eric found a similar microscope to the sort that would have been used. He had some metal workers build these brackets, and he ordered a specimen box just off the internet because visually at least, the specimen boxes haven't changed a lot in the intervening years. But the control pillars would have been quite expensive for him to have made any other way than 3D printing, because they're complex, they have angles, and well, you can see that they're fairly small, and the tolerances are important for an object like that. So what we actually learned in the initial version is that we got the angle wrong. So we printed a new version. The one that's going around is actually a new version, where we hope the angle is closer to the original. And each time we print out these pillars, it costs about $7, and it takes a few hours to redesign to change the CAD file. Okay. So I've described now a prominent case where 3D technology has made an impact on historical research, and I've given you two local examples that at least have the potential to contribute in some way to humanities research. The local examples might be kind of lower impact, but they also have a lower barrier to entry, right? That we're not using $10 million tomography equipment, we're using $10,000 3D scanners and printers. But now I want to step back and consider the question of whether 3D scanning and printing ought to be a part of this research, and how it ought to be thought about by humanities scholars. So, first, the weak thesis that 3D scanning and printing are acceptable activities for some humanistic scholars of science and technologies. So on the major argument in favor of including 3D scanning and printing of artifacts as part of a broader study is that more evidence is better, right? That's not always the case, but in certain cases, a historical argument really does need to be buttressed by active, present engagement with the artifact. Right? Sometimes it makes a difference to know what it might have been like to use a thing. So you can't rely purely on the notes that someone kept or what they published in a journal. You have to actually try it for yourself. See what it's like to twiddle the knobs. Is it easy? Is it hard? Can you reach all the knobs? Do you have to actually move away from the eyepiece to adjust something? Or can you do everything while you're looking at the signal? Right? That's the sort of thing that's the sort of lesson that active engagement can teach us. It can make certain evidence more conspicuous to us. Another way that 3D scanning and printing might help is that they can actually make available an artifact that otherwise wouldn't be available to you. So the key throw mechanism, it's in Greece, that's far away, it's expensive to travel there. They don't let just anyone go and look at that object, but anyone can download the 3D files. If what you're curious about is something that's answerable to those files, then the 3D method lets you do that from your computer. And you could print the model if you wanted to, say, try a different gear ratio and see what happened. Now, this isn't to say that other sources besides 3D scanning and printing wouldn't provide the same kind of evidence or even better evidence. It's to say that in certain cases, perhaps 3D scanning and printing, the evidence that they provide would be better than having no evidence at all. Okay, now against that argument, there are some these are basically practical arguments against using 3D scanning and printing. And they amount to 3D scanning and printing is too hard, or it's something I don't know how to do, from a disciplinary perspective. So what I'm suggesting here is that we should view a lot of the possible actions we could take, a lot of the possible investigations we could make into a technology or an artifact according to a cost-benefit analysis. What kinds of investments in time, effort, infrastructure do we need to make in order to gain these benefits? And so it might be the case that you argue, okay, maybe you can gain a little bit of information from this kind of work, but in general it's going to cost a lot, tens of thousands of dollars. It's going to take a long time, dozens of hours at least. And the gain is going to be some very minor advancement in understanding. So maybe it's not worth it. That's the practical argument And I think that's actually probably true in most cases, at least at the present day. So in those cases, don't use 3D methods. Use some other method, the method that's more efficient at answering the question. But we shouldn't stand in the way of 3D methods in those cases where they can make a big difference, as in the case of the anti-Q mechanism, and I think as in the case of even the micro-manipulator. Another aspect to consider is that even if it's too hard or in practical terms now, 3D technologies are changing fast, and maybe in a few years, these things will be available. Finally, even if you don't actually need to use 3D methods in your own research, you might actually have to evaluate them. Top-flight heritage sites like the Smithsonian Institution do have the funding and resources to do this kind of work, and they're doing it. And someone has to review that stuff. And it might as well be you. But there are also principled objections to the weak thesis, that there are principled reasons to think that perhaps 3D methods aren't acceptable activities for most humanistic scholars of science and technology. This amounts mostly, I think, to the policing of disciplinary boundaries. What's appropriate for certain types of scholars to do. So we might say, for example, that it's perfectly acceptable for archaeologists to do the kind of surface scan of a mask that I'm talking about. But that's not what historians do. Or we might say that it's okay for certain purposes, but not for others. So in the case of the micromanipulator, I had a debate with Eric as to whether the goal was to produce a working instrument or to produce something that looks right. Did we want to show in an obvious way the parts that we had added ourselves, that we had designed ourselves? Did we want to leave them looking, plastic, or did we want to paint them? In the end, we went for painting because that's what Eric wanted. He wanted a display that looked right. But you can imagine having a different goal. So we might think that 3D scanning and printing is okay for outreach or display, but not for research. Right? Maybe the sorts of things that we might want to answer in producing a replica aren't answerable by 3D scanning and printing methods. Maybe it's important that we pay attention to how an object was made originally. Maybe it's important that we pay attention to its original material properties. And maybe printing a replica out of plastic ends up confusing us and leading us down the wrong path in our research. So maybe it's epistemically dangerous, risky to take on this method. So basically this is to say that replicas where we're bringing our own situated interpretation is just not a substitute for the kind of cultivated analysis of textual sources that historians are supposed to be doing, right? Maybe we don't have the right kind of background training to interpret these sorts of objects. And I actually have quite a bit of sympathy for that kind of argument, because it is difficult to evaluate work in unfamiliar fields. And 3D printing isn't something that most historians were trained to appraise. But on the other hand, I think for history of science, and probably for most disciplines, history of science has benefited from a strongly interdisciplinary set of methods. And I think that every turn in the field, a turn to practice, a turn to material, etc., every one of those turns was accompanied by new methods and by a need to recalibrate our evidentiary standards. So that's the weak thesis. Let's turn now to the strong thesis, which says 3D scanning and printing make possible certain kinds of investigations that should now be considered necessary for making certain kinds of arguments within the humanistic studies of science and technology. The argument is that as historians or philosophers of science and technology, we sometimes ask questions whose answers are now best provided by 3D scanning and printing. And there are a couple of ways we can doubt that thesis. First, we can doubt that we ask any questions of that sort. Maybe the questions that we ask just aren't the sort that would be answerable by 3D scans or prints. Or we can doubt that 3D scans or prints, even if they could give us some answer, maybe they're just not the best answer. Right? Maybe, for example, the very information that would be required to produce a 3D print is already sufficient to answer the historical questions. Let me return to the Antikythera mechanism to clarify what I mean by this strong thesis. So earlier, I said that once de Sola Price had done the X-ray scans, everyone else had a responsibility to deal with them, either by rejecting them, giving an alternative interpretation, or by providing additional evidence. What would it mean to reject X-ray scans? I'm actually not suggesting that historians, or anyone else for that matter, ought to reject the science behind X-rays. Although, in an earlier era, that might have been the rational conservative approach toward a new form of evidence. And certainly at any given time, there will be some methods that are undeveloped, and it's not clear how they might go wrong. So it would be reasonable to doubt them. But for something that's well established like X-ray technology, it doesn't seem like a good candidate for that kind of doubt. Instead, I want to ask what I hope is a slightly more interesting question about appropriate evidence. So, rather than historians saying that X-rays don't answer historical questions, I think that historians can say that evidence from X-rays and other 3D technology might constrain historical questions, but not answer historical questions. So, put another way, historical questions might be those that are open to a certain type of interpretation. And when X-rays or other technologies close off some of those interpretations, this constitutes progress for the historian, but it should be considered extra-historical. Right? It's not actually progress by the historian that produced this advance. It's some other knowledge that's sort of outside of history that has happened to be useful for the historian. So similarly in philosophy, philosophical debates often begin with the introduction of a case or a thought experiment, and it proceeds by adjusting or ramifying the initial case to reveal different aspects of the situation. But those discussions are often tied to background assumptions about what the world is like. For example, it might rely on particular scientific theories or results from cognitive science, let's say. And when those theories are updated or overturned, they sometimes relegate a philosophical position to the dustbin. And that's good, and it constitutes progress for philosophers. But it would be disingenuous to say that a discovery in cognitive science constitutes progress by philosophers. Rather, it's that progress in cognitive science happens also to enable philosophers of mind to sharpen their focus on cases that are more relevant to what we think is true of actual minds. So the question for 3D scanning and printing is what sort of contribution they might make to history of philosophy of science. I want to suggest that one likely consequence of technological change is a shift in that cost-benefit analysis that I talked about earlier. So different kinds of investigations or different kinds of evidence are provided by new technologies. Roughly speaking, the skills and material situation changes, and that brings the cost associated with particular desired benefits down. So here are a few things that 3D scanning and printing might provide, and I've hinted at some of these already. One is an expansion of time, space, and access. Okay, so as in the case of the Antikythera mechanism, what happened is, it's actually a little bit of a perverse case if you consider the initial investigation according to cost-benefit analysis, right? These pieces are in Greece, this particular location. They're not spread around. They're never sent anywhere else. So it's hard to get there. Your time of access is limited. The way that you'd investigate something like that artifact is you go there, you have a limited number of hours over the course of a week or two to go and shine a flashlight on the device and try and read any of the inscriptions that might be visible. You can measure it and so on. You can't destructively interfere with the thing. So you have to have enough money to go and do that. You have to have the skills to do that kind of work. And all you can take away with you are your notes, maybe some photographs. But with the, if you add into the mix the generosity of HP to donate this $10 million tomography machine and all of the people to keep it running for long enough to do these investigations on this device, what you get in the end are digital files that live on the internet that anyone can access. You don't have to go to Greece anymore. This also greatly expands the time that you can spend looking at these digital scans of the artifact. Right? You can spend as much time as you want on them. You're not limited by your access to the actual artifact. Likewise, space expands or contracts as needed. You can zoom in on the digital file. I've already said basically that the result is a manipulable and portable digital representation. That means that you could actually transform it into different digital forms, right? It's not just that you have a photograph, it's that you have a scan that could be turned into computer-aided drafting design that you could, where you could change the number of teeth on a gear and you could print the thing out and see how it works. Likewise, this allows you a better ability to recreate complex shapes. That's something that would be hard to do if you're trying to sketch it yourself. And finally, I want to say that this kind of research constitutes a reallocation of skills. A lot of people would have said de-skilling there, but I prefer reallocation of skills because what's happening is you're trading one skill for another, rather than having the skill of being able to hold a flashlight at a particular angle that lets you read inscriptions off of an artifact quickly enough to sketch them down and then get out of the archive before you're kicked out. Now the skill is being able to manipulate a digital file. Right? So it's a reallocation of skills that enables different sorts of research. Okay. Most of us don't have access to multi-million-dollar tomography equipment, as I said, but we might have access to 3D scanners and printers like the ones that we have upstairs in the lab. So here's a quick comparison of a couple of the scanners that we have upstairs. That I hope gives you something of an idea of what they might be capable of. So first, we have this GoScan scanner that costs $30,000 and a Kinect scanner that costs $90. They both hook up to computers. They both require some software. They can both scan objects from yay big to as big as a car. Their accuracy is, an order of magnitude apart at best. Similarly for the resolution, I have no idea what the measurement rate is for the Kinect, but the GoScan is very proud to say that they can do 550,000 measurements per second, whatever that means. And similarly, a chart for the 3D printers. So here, the resolution, which I've sort of translated into DPI for people who are things look when you print them out on paper. The expensive printer that costs $45,000 can do a pretty good job of printing something out. The MakerBot prints things where you can actually feel the ridges between the layers. Right? They can both print objects, that would fit inside a bread box. They're somewhat costly to print, but all of these costs are going down. And what I want to suggest about this is that technologies like these ones are subject to rapid improvement. So to use, again, an already overused comparison, Moore's law for computing power goes like this. The level of capability that you can buy for a certain price doubles in 18 months. Or if you want to look at it in the sort of reverse angle, the price that you would pay for a given level of capability is cut in half every 18 months. Now, this isn't to say that 3D technologies are necessarily subject to an exponential law like the same way that computer chips are. And it's not to say that the doubling period is 18 months, but until some rather distant physical barriers are reached, it seems likely that 3D printing will improve at a rapid clip. Okay. So far, I've discussed a prominent example of how 3D technologies have impacted HPS research in the past, and a couple of local examples that I hope in their own way might contribute a little bit. And I've also examined what I call the weak and strong arguments for adopting those methods in history and philosophy of science. And I've suggested some of the technological possibilities that 3D methods might unlock. And I've characterized the currently available technologies in the hopes that those might somehow translate into the idea that some profitable work can already be done, and that more profitable work can be done in the future. But now I want to step back even one further step and think more broadly about the relationship between disciplinary standards and technological possibilities. This is in keeping with a sort of general methodological commitment that I have to ground my philosophical work in real cases, and also to reason from these individual cases to general conclusions. So for those of you who don't like philosophy, I apologize for the rest of the talk. So elsewhere, I've written that I favor a view that combines what I call practicability and responsibility. And I say this: a belief is justified inasmuch as it's responsibly formed, where a responsible subject is one who does, to the extent that she can, what's required of her in a particular situation to bring about true and rational beliefs. Responsibility is here delimited in part by role expectations within particular situations, while practicability is delimited by facts about the subject's competencies as well as her technological, ethical, and economic circumstances. Thus, both what's practicable and what a subject is responsible to do will vary from person to person and from situation to situation. Okay. So, I want to talk about responsibility. Suppose a headstrong physicist doesn't listen to criticism. Right? He's just given a talk and people are responding to his talk, and he's not listening. He's really caught up in his own genius. And so he doesn't hear the evidence that's presented as criticism. Is he nevertheless just as justified as if the criticism had never been made? No. Ignorance is not an excuse in a case like that, right? That physicist is expected to have listened to the criticism. That's what peer review is all about. That's what it is to be a responsible physicist. Another example from science: suppose that we're seeking to explain demographic differences in SAT performance. If a scientist is so focused on possible biological explanations that she ignores possible cultural factors, is she being irresponsible? I think yes. There's a responsibility to seek out those sorts of alternative available evidence. So this fits into the general view in philosophy called responsibilism. It's the view that justification depends on epistemically responsible action. It was once actually very well accepted and respected, and it's seen a little bit of resurgence in recent years in the form of something called virtue responsibilism. The idea is I think is quite straightforward. It's that when we form beliefs, we have a responsibility to do a good job. Role responsibilities are a good example of this. Judges, doctors, scientists, etc., they have special training and special responsibilities to actually use that training when they're making judgments within their professional circumstances. But even more generically, if you have the basic epistemic goal of forming true and rational beliefs, not everyone does, not all the time, that entails that, for example, you should ensure that your information is as unbiased or as complete as you can, or at least that it's complete enough to make the sort of judgment that you're trying to make. The challenge is finding a principled way of determining which of the conceivable responsibilities that you might think of, which ones do you actually have to fulfill. Okay, so more philosophy with apologies. Responsibilism contrasts with these two other views, evidentialism and reliabilism, which I'm just going to very briefly say what they are and say how responsible is. Even if you decide that you're a reliabilist instead of a responsibilist, I'm going to say why my view is relevant to you. So evidentialism says that the justification for a belief depends solely on the evidence you actually have. Usually that's the beliefs you already have in your head, not even counting the evidence that's in front of you. It's just what you have in your head. But we've already discussed an example where ignoring evidence, in general, we think ignoring evidence isn't a good excuse for coming to the wrong conclusions. At the very least, we have the responsibility to form beliefs with our eyes open to other forms of evidence. So evidentialists would probably say that I'm unfair in my characterization of their view, and that of course we have to be open to potential evidence. And I say fine, but we should understand that as a responsibilist criterion for evidentialism. Similarly, reliabilism says reliabilism also has some aspects of responsibility built into the usual accounts. The view itself says that justification for a belief depends on the truth conduciveness of the belief-forming process. Okay? That's usually understood as the cognitive process of coming to a conclusion, not the investigative process that puts evidence in your head. Right? And here I want to say maybe we ought to pay at least a little attention to that whole thing where you get the ideas in your head in the first place. Right? That's where responsibility would come in. Okay. The challenge for responsibilism and one of the reasons that it fell out of favor is that it's really hard to figure out how to operationalize epistemic responsibilities. We might think of all sorts of possible actions that might, in certain weird cases, help us come to the right conclusion. Are we responsible to check all of those things? In practice, we have to choose just a few actions. Right? Again, this is to say that we should perform some kind of cost-benefit analysis here. Right? There are a lot of beliefs we form that really it doesn't matter so much whether we're right or wrong about them. We shouldn't invest a whole lot in making sure that we're right about those things. We should invest our attention on the cases where it matters. Right? So there are limits to our responsibility, and they depend in part on what we're going to use our beliefs for, and they depend in part on our abilities to perform certain actions. Right? So checking whether a letter has arrived entails that I go and check my mailbox, right? But I don't have to check in all the other mailboxes to make sure that it wasn't misdelivered. And I don't have to check behind the shelf to make sure that it didn't fall back there. Although I might do that if it's a really important letter. And it certainly doesn't mean that I need to go to the post office and check behind their shelves to make sure that the letter didn't fall back there. Right? There are limits to my responsibility. I can think of all sorts of things that I could do, but I don't have to do all of those things. So my proposal for a principled way of determining which of the responsibilities we actually have to fulfill is that responsibilities have to be practicable. So practicability is a function of, as I said before, competencies plus logistical, technological, economic, ethical, conceptual, and material possibilities. I've talked a little bit today about technological possibilities, so that's where that comes in. And this is, I think, what allows us to operationalize our responsibilities and actually do the calculus of weighing them according to costs versus the potential epistemic benefits. And now, finally, we can come full circle, and this is what I think goes on when a new technology comes out. So practicability sets a limit on which candidate responsibilities are actually in play. Which ones are you actually going to be able to do? If something is not possible for you to do, maybe you have to reserve judgment. Right? But if it is practicable, maybe you're responsible to do it. Right? The other axis is between what you're not responsible to do and what you are responsible to do. So maybe you are responsible to check your mail slot, but you're not responsible to go to the post office and ask them whether the letter has arrived, right? And what I think new technologies sometimes do is they move things either from impracticability to practicability. So that, I think, is pretty clear. That sometimes happens. But more interestingly, they sometimes also move things from where you're not responsible for doing it to where you are responsible for doing it, because of the way that it shifts the cost-benefit analysis. Now, it actually is possible to do a 3D scan of something and take internal measurements. So maybe you're responsible to do that. And that's it. Thank you.